You know, the turnout in the last mayoral election was very low, I think in the low 20, something like that. In fact, I think Rahm's total vote was roughly 15% of the eligible voters. So the majority of Chicagoans who could vote don't. But so if you then could stir some of these people into voting, that would bode very well for you. But you know, I feel that when it comes to politics in this city, there's a lot of cynicism and sarcasm, which to my mind is a mask for hopelessness. They don't really believe that anything could change. And so what can your campaign say or do that might restore some hope, some confidence that things can get better?
Our campaign will energize people because it shows an alternative to the way things are. I think, and even stepping out and saying that we're challenging this mayor, I think that in and of itself has energized people because it showed that the way things are is not the way things need to be. It began to chip away at the sense of inevitability about the way things are, and that's so important. I think the low voter turnout is because people have checked out of the electoral process because they don't have a sense of self-efficacy about what their vote means to changing the outcomes of their daily lives. And we are the ones that have to change that. So our goal is really to get people to understand that, yes, you do have a say in determining what your communities look like, that you don't have to accept leadership that is not working in your interests. You don't have to accept a system that is no longer catering to you. And you can do that by getting involved, whether it's organizing people around a candidate, and even just on election day going out to vote. And I think we have to give them a reason to be excited about democracy again. And that's the bigger conversation. And this is a conversation that to me is global. Getting people to believe in the quality of democracy and to believe that it's worth being involved in the democratic process. And when we show them that, I think they will begin to take steps to feel that, okay, maybe if I vote, that might change some things. And even in other aspects, just getting more involved in their community. That's the sort of change that I think happens when people feel that their democracy is actually going to work in their interests. And we provide that vision with our campaign.
Right. You know, somebody said, the reason people don't vote is because they don't want to be made a fool of, and they feel like they're being made a fool. Let's talk about some of your campaign issues. There are dozens of important issues. I've noticed that successful campaigns tend to focus on a handful, just a few. So what are the issues that you plan to run on?
The biggest issues that we're running on are education, public safety, jobs to a certain extent, and then the city's financial and fiscal circumstances. Those are the big issues that we are addressing.
Okay, let's break it down a little bit. To education, where are the we've all seen what's happened with the closing of the schools and the growth of the charter schools and testing and the hostility between and all that. So where do you attack this situation from?
Well, the overarching point that we make is that it's time we have to put education back into the hands of professionals who are interested in working with the communities to meet their needs. That is the most important factor because we've seen that our current education system is more geared toward corporate managers and using a business model in the education context, which simply does not work. So that's the biggest point that we make. We also talk about extensively fully funding our public neighborhood schools. We cannot create a dual education system, which is what we have. So we do support a freeze on charter schools and fully funding our public neighborhood schools to make sure that they have the resources that they need. We talk about an elected school board because we do need a dose of democracy in our education system. People are feeling that their voice is not being heard in decisions that are being made. So that's how we advocate for an elected school board. We also talk about a high quality curriculum that is building well-rounded individuals, not just good test takers. And so for that, it has to be enriched. We talk about bringing back the arts. Vocational education is critical if we're going to have individuals that are prepared for the economy when they graduate from school. And then, support for our teachers and administrators. To demonize teachers is one of the worst things that we can do, especially when we already have substantial challenges in attracting teachers to our highest need schools. So we have to make sure that our teachers are supported, that our administrators and staff are supported, and that they are allowed to really thrive in the profession. So those are just a handful of things that we talk about, and even strengthening the LSCs, empowering them so that there's more force behind them.
The LSCs, the local school councils. Okay. You mentioned jobs, and now I know Rahm has kind of bragged about the jobs that he's brought to the city. What do you think of that, and what would your approach be?
Our approach is to actually do what has made Chicago strong economically in the past. So it's about creating jobs in the sectors that have the most potential for growth. So in Chicago, it's manufacturing, it's transportation, it's healthcare. And so we need a comprehensive jobs program for the 300,000 unemployed individuals in this city. And they should be low barrier to entry jobs that have wages that are individual sustaining and family sustaining. And so for us, that means we have to have a strong workforce development initiative that starts in our education system, that starts even in middle school and high school, where individuals have the opportunity to get training in those sectors so that they can be plugged into the economy. That's a lot different from our current strategy, which is to attract headquarters to the city, which is fine, but who benefits from those jobs? A study done by, I think it was released by the Grassroots Collaborative about a year or so ago, showed that of all of the jobs that were created downtown through the headquarters that came into the city, a very small percentage actually went to individuals that lived in other parts of the city of Chicago. And so who's benefiting when we do that? It's not the residents of this city. So our strategy is about how do we design a strong workforce pipeline, which requires a strong educational system to train individuals in high value add sectors where there are low barriers to entry, where they can sustain themselves and their families. I think that's what our economic development strategy should be built on.
Okay, is that going to require a lot more money?
It requires a reallocation of existing dollars. Mm-hmm. So this is about prioritizing the money that we already spend. And so it doesn't, to do this kind of work, it's actually just reorganizing the money that we do spend in different areas. The money that we give in tax breaks to some of our corporate partners, the money that we allocate to other things, maybe to trying to attract businesses, is money that can be diverted to a very strong, comprehensive workforce development initiative. So it really is more about prioritizing and reallocating than having to identify new revenue for this.
When we talk about, I'm going to take a little detour here. When we talk about reprioritizing funding, the word TIF comes up often, and there's a lot of, Tom Kresser says there's $500 million hidden in, or more than that, hidden in accounts waiting to be. And I don't know, what do you know about, is that a pot of gold? Is, I guess, what I'm asking there at the end of the TIF rainbow, or can we muck around on that and just find the money that we need?
Well, the thing about the tax increment financing and TIF dollars is that there's an original purpose for TIFs. And the reason why they were created is to help spur development in blighted communities. Now, we've moved so far away, exactly, from what blight means. And so you'll see TIF dollars being used to build a stadium in the South Loop, or TIF dollars being used to build another selective enrollment school on the north side of Chicago.
Or a hotel in Hyde Park.
Exactly. So I think it's more about getting back to the original purposes for why TIFs were created, so that we're actually using it to spur development in our blighted, our challenged communities, and also being able to use those funds for the things that are necessary. So, our school system, how do we divert some of those dollars for our schools? There are other uses that I think are much more appropriate, especially because these are our tax dollars. And then the other component is the lack of transparency and oversight and accountability for how TIF dollars are spent. Who makes the decisions? How did they come to those decisions? Why were those decisions made? Who was involved in the process? And then how can we get access to information that explains this? That's not just taking 10,000 pages of documents and posting it in PDFs online. That's not transparency. So I think just the process issues, along with the way that TIF dollars are used, are the reasons why it hasn't really been able to benefit the city as much as it could.
Okay. Now you also mentioned public safety, I think, as one of your issues. So how, and we all know the painful headlines that talk about young people, people being shot almost every weekend. What would you do differently than what the current administration has done?
Well, we would start by being honest about our crime statistics.
Oh.
I think that's
that's
the best place to start. So really being honest about how big of an issue it is the best way to really address the issue. I think public safety, I think violence is an issue of investment. I think that we have to be interested in getting to the root of violence, as opposed to focusing on the back end, which is more on the policing and the policing component. We have to invest. We have to invest in human capital and in resources. When we invest in human capital, that ties back into this workforce development. When people have jobs, they can find productive ways of sustaining themselves that don't require crime. If we invest in things like restorative justice, as opposed to locking up our young people, so that with restorative justice, they can actually be rehabilitated so that they can be productive members of society. If we invest in programming, extracurricular programming, that young people can be engaged in when they're out of school or after school, then they're not engaged in other things. If we invest in our mental health services, for example, then people can get access to the services that they need. That's also a public safety issue. So it really is, violence is an issue of investment in human capital and in resources in the areas where they're most needed. When you invest at that level, it naturally will reduce the crime rate. But I think for too long, the city has been focused more on shifting numbers or manipulating data so that it looks like they're addressing the issue instead of really focusing on addressing the issue.
Mm-hmm. I think at your speech you also did mention, though, that you wanted to put more police on the street.
Yes, I think that overtime is not viable as a way of really addressing policing. I think that it puts both police officers and the individuals that are in those communities in danger. When you have individuals who've been working long hours and then they're potentially volatile situations in communities, I just think it's dangerous. I think the best way is to actually have more officers on the street.
Okay. I have a few other items here, and maybe we can just do this quickly without this healthcare. The city has closed a number of clinics to save money.
Yes.
These were general health clinics, but also the mental health clinics. What are your thoughts about that?
I thought that it was egregious to close the 6 mental health clinics that were closed because we saved not even $2 million. And yet the impact on the lives of so many who relied on those services is far-reaching. I think that, again, this comes down to our priorities and how we allocate the funding and the money that we do have as a city. And I think it's more important for us to make sure that our most vulnerable population has the resources and services that they need than some of the other uses that we found for our public dollars. And so I think those clinics should have stayed open. And it's been devastating in those communities.
Mm-hmm. Housing, I've often don't talk as much now, but we used to talk a lot about affordable housing. Do you see the need for that in the city, or do we already have affordable housing?
Well, I think we need to commit to protecting affordable housing. Even as developments are taking place, I think it requires a commitment even from developers to make sure that people are not getting displaced and that people have the option of staying in their communities. We've seen all too often where people are forced out of their communities because they can no longer afford it, or where developers have creative ways that they've come up with to get around having to have affordable housing on site in their projects. Mm-hmm. And that requires, in my opinion, much more oversight and much more of an explicit commitment by developers to say, we will have X number of affordable housing units on site so that we can make sure that people have an average individuals who perhaps don't have as much money can still live in the communities in which many of them have grown up in.
Our mayor says that we need a property tax hike, or did say, a property tax hike to fund pensions. And that's the real bills that are coming due. What do you say about that?
I think we have to look at all options on the table. I think one of the things that I talk about is a financial transaction tax, or a LaSalle Street tax, which is a tax on the markets, on trades. I think that it does not hurt the residents who have already been bearing so much burden in trying to make up for our city's fiscal mismanagement for decades. And so that's something that I think we have to look at before we start to again shift the burden back onto taxpayers. I don't think that we can bear much more. What happens is the city is becoming so unaffordable that people are moving out. And when people move out, that's our tax base that's leaving. That's our revenue that's leaving. And so we have to make sure that we're looking to share the burden of our city's fiscal health much more equitably between our corporate partners, our corporations, and the financial sector. So until we consider that, I don't think that we can really have a genuine conversation about raising our property taxes yet again.
Okay. I'm thinking that people are probably going to say Amara is a very impressive woman, but she doesn't have the political experience of Rahm Emanuel. What would you reply to that?
I'm glad I don't have the political experience of Rahm Emanuel. I think I have the right kind of experience that's required to lead a city of this size, a city of this type, a city with this history. And I think for too long we've relied on individuals that had the experience of Rahm Emanuel and others like him. And that's why we're in the circumstances that we're in. I think we need a drastic departure in the typical leadership that the city has been used to. And the qualities, now we have to really focus on what kinds of qualities do we need as a city. Do you want someone who comes out of the financial sector, who made money basically in that sector? Do you want someone who never has worked at the grassroots level, who doesn't understand community development, who doesn't even know, the richness of Chicago's diverse communities, and who doesn't have the curiosity to engage? Do you want someone who understands the public sector as much as the private sector, as much as what's happening at the grassroots level? Or do you want someone who's one-dimensional and driven by ambition? So I think that it's actually a compliment to not have that experience, and I think that people are looking for leadership that does not have his experience, his temperament, or his ideas on what Chicago should be.